Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today we're going to take a look at the new mass market edition of the Wanderer's Tarot by Casey Zabala and published by Wiser Books. The Wanderer's Tarot was born out of the desire for a tarot deck centered in feminine wisdom and elemental magic. The cards are based on traditional tarot symbolism, which has been transmuted by the need for feminine insight and awakening. For the magical practitioner, these cards speak to our magical tools and talismans. The suits of moons, stones, knives, and feathers will lead you to a deeper understanding of your personal power, emotionally, materially, mentally, and passionately. The Wanderer's Tarot is a tarot deck for modern witches centering on earth-based wisdom for spiritual practice, self-care, ritual, and personal magic. So the Wanderer's Tarot comes in this beautiful hard box, and one of the things that I really like about this packaging is it does have just the little paper flap here with the information on the back and the barcode and all of that. Now, while this whole package came wrapped in plastic, which I of course have opened and gotten prepared for this whole video, what I love about this is removable. So now we're looking at the back of the box, which is just this beautiful illustration with all of the different emblems on the back. And I think that that is a really interesting and wonderful choice because it makes this box feel less like packaging material and more like a meaningful keepsake to keep the cards in. Now, I do want to mention that I did have the indie edition of the Wanderer's Tarot. I wish I still had it just to share with you here today so you could see the differences between the two. Now, as far as I know, none of the artwork has changed. It does have a little bit different cardstock, which actually doesn't bother me because one of the reasons why I moved the indie edition of this deck along is because it was really big and bulky and kind of hard for me to work with, even though I absolutely love the artwork. We have the little emblems on the inside, which also have the directions, which is kind of interesting. And it does come with a little pamphlet, which we will look at after we take a peek at the cards. So the card design is still the same. I do remember this backing from the indie edition, which is quite nice. I do really like it. The indie edition, I do believe, was black edged, I think. And this is edged in silver gilding, which, you know, is not always my favorite. The biggest difference between this deck and the indie edition is I do believe the indie edition was matte, where this is glossy. You can see it's catching my lights there. However, I don't think it detracts from the artwork at all. And it actually makes the deck, the cards slide a little bit easier. So we'll see when we go to shuffle it what that feels like. But to start off with, let's go ahead and jump into these cards. So here we have our Fool with beginnings, potential, energy, and seeking. We have our Magician with creation, manifest, use your tools. The High Priestess with veiled truth, intuition, authenticity. Our Empress with birth, gestation, fertility, and feminine authority. Our Emperor with creating and maintaining material order. Our Hierophant with spiritual authority. The Lovers for prana, romantic or spiritual union. The Chariot with harnessing will, connecting with passion. Strength for mind over matter. The Hermit with directed by truth and following the inner light. The Wheel of Fortune for fate has the reins and success. Justice for moral compass and seeking balance. The Hanged Man with inverted reality and surrender. Death with the ending of a cycle. Temperance for transmutation. The Devil for chaos, creativity, addiction, and embracing shadow. The Tower for reordering, change, and upheaval. The Star for hope, understand, and inspiration. The Moon for introspect, dream, and recollect. The Sun for Mother Nature consciousness and inner child. Judgment for awakening to a new reality. And the World with feeling in the divine flow. So moving into our minor arcana, we have the Feathers with the suit of desire and passion, representative of a spirit flight and associated with the fire element. So here we have the Ace of Feathers, which would be the Ace of Wands. And in this deck, each of the cards are approached numerologically, so the aces are the purest form of the corresponding suit. So here we have our Two of Feathers, and in this deck, the twos represent union and opposites. Our Three of Feathers, threes representing gestation, growth, and birth. Our 4 of feathers, with the 4s representing even and material unity. Our 5 of feathers, with the 5s representing balance, magic, and creation. Our 6 of feathers, with our 6s representing beauty and love. Our 7 of feathers, with our 7s representing conflict and struggle. Here we have our 8 of feathers, with our 8s representing meditation and reflection. Here we have our 9 of feathers, with our 9s representing chaos before perfection. And our 10 of feathers, with our 10s representing endings and completion. So for our court cards, we have a couple of change in the titles. Here we see the philosopher, which is a student or a teacher, forever gaining knowledge, the dismantling of ideas. So next we have our goddesses representing a strong, nurturing figure with true emanating power, the embodiment of their suit, a fully blossomed flower. Next we have our prophets. The prophets are the seer and the seeker, one with knowledge to inform their future through will and action. And finally, we have the wanderer for each suit. The wanderer is a buoyant, excited traveler, ready to take on the gifts of the cosmos and ready to risk all. So moving into our suit of knives, standing in place for our swords, we have the knives representing the discerning forces of the intellect, logic, and reason associated with the air element and learning. So here we have our ace of knives, our 2, 3 of knives, our 4, the 5 of knives, and our 6, 7, 8 of knives, our 9 of knives, our 10. Moving into our courts, we have our philosopher of knives, our goddess of knives, prophet of knives, and our wanderer of knives. Next, we have our suit of moons standing in place for our cups. The moons represent emotions, psychic channels related to healing, and the tides of water tied to love and the creative. So here we have our ace of moons, our 2, our 3 of moons, and our 4, the 5 of moons, the 6, 7 of moons, and our 8, 9 of moons, our 10 of moons. Moving into our courts, we have our philosopher, our goddess, the prophet, and our wanderer. Next, we have our suit of stones, which is standing in place for our pentacles. The stones represent what is harvested and sown in the earth, associated with the economy and material wealth. So here we have our ace of stones, our 2, 3 of stones, 4 of stones, our 5, the 6 of stones, 7, 8 of stones, our 9, and our 10 of stones. And finally, we have our courts with the philosopher, the goddess, the prophet, and the wanderer. So now that we've had a chance to take a look at the cards, let's take a little peek at the foldout. We have a little bit about the tarot itself, and we have the suit associations, which I called out as we were looking through the cards, showing you how the moon, stones, feathers, and knives and what they relate to. I do love that this deck relates elementally, but you can also definitely see the clear correspondences between our traditional suits, with the moons representing the cups, the stones representing the pentacles, the feathers representing the wands, and the knives representing swords. This deck, as I mentioned, also corresponds numerologically, which I really appreciate because that is more closely aligned to with the way that I read tarot. So we have a little bit of a numerological association. They don't all line up exactly with my personal associations, but I do appreciate that that is in here. We have the court cards and a little information about each of them, which I did call out as we were looking through the cards because the titles have been changed. We have philosopher, goddess, prophet, and wanderer in place of our page, knight, queen, and king. So here we have a little bit of a few keywords for each of the major arcana, again, which I called out as we were looking through the deck. And then it opens up. And this is really interesting because we have a little fold out here that tells you a little bit about each of the associations. So we have for water, we have the moons here with Tadare, and it says compassion, emotion, love, associations with summer, cups and hearts, Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces. So this is really interesting. I think this could be key to really pulling in some additional elements into working with this deck. So for the feathers, we have to will. for fire, related to desire and spirit, corresponds to the wands, and some keywords are action, passion, relating to spring, creation, and the zodiac of Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. So here we have the knives with to know, relating to air. We have thought, intellect, and mind, relating to the swords, challenges, and winter, with the associations of Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius. And then we have to be silent with the earth. I love that. For physical grounding, relating to the pentacles and connects to health, wealth, and matter. For home and fall, and relating to Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn. I really like the associations for these particular suits. I think that works really well. It does definitely line up with how I work with the tarot association, so I really appreciate that. And as you can see, the little pamphlet, the deck, and everything fits right into the box, which is always appreciated because that sits nicely on a shelf. So let's talk real quick about the cards. Now, this is not my first time seeing this deck. As I mentioned, I did have the indie edition, and the cardstock was quite a bit different in that one. The artwork is very minimalistic and the minors are very pippish. So we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But let's real quick just take a little peek at the majors and talk about a couple things. I like that we get the idea of the Fool here, and it's not really tied into the exact representation of the RWS, which is how we tend to see a lot of RWS inspired decks. And so I like that we have all the main elements here. We have the kind of person who's looking outwards. We have some mountains in the background. We have the dog here. So you have all the key elements that you can associate with the Fool. But again, we're not really locked into that visually of the person standing on the cliff with the dog nipping at their heels, and I do quite appreciate that. This Magician is very traditional looking, so it's kind of interesting how we have a little bit of both in here, something that's a little bit more representative of the energy of the card, and then here we have more of a literal translation of the card itself. We do have some extra elements here. There's like a little tent back here in the background, which I think is pretty nice, and it does relate back to that wanderer idea. Again, the High Priestess, all the elements, but it's more of the representation of the imagery rather than an exact duplicate of the artwork that we see on the traditional RWS. So I do quite like that. The Empress is really interesting because we have the Empress as the cow figure, and then the Emperor, we have kind of just all the symbols of the Emperor. Here we have our Chariot, which is a really interesting card in this deck because we have that clunky RWS Chariot here, that kind of idea of it, but inside is the heart. And to me, this is a card that really speaks to the idea of following your heart's path. And I think that's really interesting for the Chariot. This Hermit card I think is really cool because we have, rather than the lantern, we have the candle kind of in the head area, and then we have the illumination coming from the hand. I think that's quite interesting. I like this Wheel of Fortune card where we have the snakes kind of coming together in the sort of Ouroboros, and then we have all the directions in the center. I think that's a really interesting interpretation. I like this Justice because it pulls in the knife that we see in the suit of swords, so I think that's lovely. This Death card I think is so funny. Like, he's like waving, hello, how are you? I'm just coming to take you away. Here we have Temperance, which I do like because we have these kind of two mountains with the lake in between that's pooling into this cup of fire. Lots of symbology going on in this card, which I think is quite lovely. This Tower, again, we see all those traditional imageries. Here's the tower, here's the lightning, we have people falling out of it, but we definitely see that it's like on this solid structure. Here we have the lightning coming out of the eye, which I do like. That's quite interesting. And the Star card is quite beautiful. It's like a line drawing of, I mean, it's all line drawing, but it is a very traditional star card in terms of we have the lady, but I love that instead of like standing, she's sitting in kind of that lotus position, and she does feel very much in balance with nature here, and I think that's lovely. I love the Sun card. It's one of my favorite cards in the deck, which is not something I normally say about a sun card, but we have the hands holding the sun, and I think that's quite beautiful. This Judgment card is also really interesting. We have this kind of garden down here, this idea of you reap what you sow kind of thing, and we have the eye with the tears coming out of it. It's really interesting Judgment card, quite powerful, I think. And then again, this beautiful World card. We do have the little hat there. There are some representations that could tie into that witchy energy, should you choose to tap into that. But one of the things that I do like about this deck is that it isn't overly witchy. So if you don't follow a witchy path, you don't necessarily have to tap into that type of energy. But I think this World card is lovely because we have kind of the person contained within their own sort of little universe here. You can see all the stars outside of it, but as you can see, there's nothing within. It's kind of like almost like a cosmic egg type of reference, which I think is pretty cool. So let's take a closer look at the minor arcana now, because as you might have noticed, this is very much a pip deck. Whereas we don't have full scenes depicted in each of the cards. We just have kind of the idea, the representation, the symbolic, numerological, and elemental representation rather than a full scene being depicted. So while it's still an illustrated deck, it doesn't have scenic minors, it has pip style minors. So here in the Ace of Feathers, for example, we have feathers relating to the element of fire and the suit of spirit and desire, wands representing those actions and passions and creation, right? So here we have this little nest here that's being warmed up and getting ready for this new creation to be birthed here, this new thing to begin, which relates very well back to the energy of the ace, the idea of new things being created. So if you remember correctly, we talked about the ace being the purest form of the corresponding suit. So in a sense, this is the birth of spirit. So here you can see we just have two feathers and they are kind of in opposition to each other, or perhaps maybe balancing each other out. Here we have the three feathers all collected together in that jar. So that idea of maybe collaboration, of working together, of things coming together to create something bigger than themselves. And you can see that we have this kind of illustrations throughout the minor arcana. So herein we have the Eight of Wands, and if we remember that 8 numerologically in this deck is the idea of reflection and meditation. And I think we can see that imagery kind of represented here beautifully in all of these feathers kind of swirling together, working together in this almost sort of whirl of energy here. And remember that the feathers are relating to the suit of wands or the element of fire. So we have that idea of kind of taking a moment to pause and reflect and meditate on what it is that you're creating. So here we have the 10. We can see there's 5 feathers in balance with each other here. And the idea with the 10s being, of course, endings or completion. And our court cards are quite different because they have all been renamed. Yeah, I think you could probably relate them back to their traditional imagery. If we have the philosopher, talked about being kind of the student teacher, this idea of kind of learning those lessons, taking those lessons that you've maybe learned throughout the whole suit and putting them into action. I think that works quite well. We have the goddess here with the idea of that full embodiment of the suit. So here we have the prophet with that kind of seeker-seer who holds all the knowledge of their suit. And then we have the wanderer who's the excited traveler ready to take a risk. I feel like if you were to relate these back to their traditional associations, I feel like the wanderer is more of a kind of night energy where we're taking what we've learned and we're taking it out and putting it out into the world, which I think is quite interesting to kind of come at the end of the court cards. So looking at these, we have kind of the student, the learning to embody our suit, the goddess who has become that embodiment of the suit, the prophet who kind of understands everything that they've learned throughout the suit, and then the wanderer who takes that knowledge and puts it out into the world. And I think that's quite interesting. I don't know if that's actually the associations that was the intention, but that's kind of how I have seen them in, of course, walking through the deck, but also in my work with this deck in my previous copy of the India edition. So again, we have more of the pip style with the knives here relating to the suit of swords. But these are much more open to interpretation than I think a more scenic style deck is, because there's not a set scene being depicted. So we can pull in more of our own associations in terms of numerological, elemental, the symbology that we see on the card, and of course our own tarot knowledge. And I think that's quite interesting. It's one of the reasons why I do actually like pip decks, because they are quite a bit more open. So let's talk real quick about my favorite suit in in this deck, which is the suit of moons, which I think is a wonderful suit to associate to what would traditionally be the suit of cups, the element of water, and embodying emotion. And I think the moons work beautifully for that. I love this idea of the moons taking place of the cups. We can see that kind of energy represented here. Here you can see in the 6, we have that balance with the phases of the moon. It's quite lovely. But again, you can see very, very pip style, so very open to interpretation. And you can look at what do these shapes, what do these symbols, what does the element of water, what does the suit of cups mean to you, what does the moon represent to you? And I think that's quite interesting. I do love this one with the fire here, and we have all the moons around it. I think that's quite beautiful. So one of the things that I think a deck like this, a very minimalistic pip style deck, works really, really well for is actually working with Oracle. So I'm going to talk about that here in a moment, but before we do that, let's go ahead and give this deck a little bit of a shuffle. It does feel like it's a fairly decent quality gilding, which is nice. It is on the larger side for tarot, so it is closer to Oracle size. I do have very small hands, so it's often hard for me to get my hands around a deck like this, but I can get my hands around it and I can shuffle it. It's probably going to be even better if I half it and shuffle it this way. Now, if you have larger hands than I do, you'll probably have no problem shuffling this deck. It does riffle shuffle beautifully. So we get that nice flexible bend in here. Let's see, and because of course it is kind of that glossy cardstock, it does overhand fairly well. Again, I have small hands, so I struggle with this. I'm actually tempted to trim this deck down a little bit, just to make it even a little bit easier for me to get my hands around and work with. Like I said, if you have larger hands than I do, it's probably going to be a bit easier for you to shuffle. The glossy is not great when you're on camera, but when I'm just doing my normal readings, glossy cardstock really doesn't bother me any. It's just when I'm trying to film, and most people don't use their cards that way. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about working with this deck with Oracle. So back when I had this deck in the Indie edition, my favorite deck to pair it with was Denise Linn's Sacred Destiny Oracle. It's this deck right here. And this pairing for me was just absolutely beautiful. And one of the things, as I mentioned, that I like about using a pip deck is that I feel like I can pair it more easily with some of my busier Oracle decks. So Oracle decks that have really full, rich, scenic imagery in them. One of the things that this kind of minimalistic art style does really well is to help you kind of draw out a deeper layer and deeper messages from your Oracle deck. So here you can see we have power in between the Tower and the Prophet of Feathers. So if we're looking to cultivate this energy of power here, we can look to the things that we can shake up and that we can change to help us cultivate the power that we need to be able to see and understand the full spectrum of what it is that we're trying to create here. For me, it just creates a little bit more of a clearer message in terms of kind of expanding upon focal point of the Oracle card. So let's do another one real quick, just so you can see here. So here we have Truth between the 6 of Feathers and the 3 of Feathers. Obviously, I didn't shuffle really well. The 6 of Feathers, where we have all of these feathers kind of lined up in a row. Sixes to me really speak to the idea of sort of harmony and balance. In this deck, they also represent beauty and love. So we can look at this as where can we find some beauty and love, or some balance and harmony in truth, and how can we bring that together here as we see in this 3 of Feathers. How can we bring that together in some sort of creation or collaboration? Here's an interesting one. Here we have community between the Devil and the Goddess of Feathers. So to me, we have this beautiful rainbow coming through in this community card. Maybe that idea of kind of letting go of some of that shadowy energy that sometimes happens in community, and really just embodying what it is that you want to cultivate within this space. And I think that, again, just creates a really cohesive, really beautiful message. So we'll just take a couple little flip through some of them so that you can see them together. I do really love this pairing, and I was kind of kind of glad to be able to get a hold of this deck again. With it being mass market, I do feel like a little bit like if I want to trim it, then I'm feeling like a little better about that too, because I did really go back and forth on whether or not to pass on my indie copy, because I really do quite love the artwork and I really love the simplistic nature of it. And when you pair it with a really full, colorful, beautiful oracle deck, it really does help to bring out some beautiful messages, I think. So I'll just take a flip through a couple more. Beautiful flexibility there in the center. All right, and just for fun, let's pull out a couple more oracle decks to pair it with. So here we have another example with the Enchanted Map. This is the new re-release of it. So it is the borderless edition. And again, you can see where we have that same idea of the kind of really full, very detailed, colorful oracle card in the center. Then we have the more minimalistic tarot to provide the expansion upon that center message or that focal point. And I think it works quite beautifully. I feel like I've got too many there, so let's half that. So here we have education between the Three of Swords, or Three of Knives. Love this. It's not a heart with 3 swords through it, and the Wanderer of Moons. So really this idea of maybe learning something new, doing something different, and that's going to take you on a new journey. I love that we have the moons here, and she is sitting at the on the rocks by the ocean. I think that's quite beautiful. Here we have the Dragon's Lair between the Two of Knives and the Nine of Feathers. I think that when you pair decks like this where you're pulling in 2 completely different art styles, they really help to kind of draw something beautiful out of each other. So here we have Spark between the Two of Moons and the Sun. That is quite beautiful, isn't it? Listening between the Chariot and the Moon. So now let's pull in a little bit of animal energy. I have the animal spirit, the wild unknown animal spirit here, and you can see how we can pull in that animal energy for our central point as well. Now in this case, these art styles are a bit more similar, so they feel aesthetically a little bit more like they kind of flow together in a story a little bit better. So here we have Crow between the Empress and the Prophet of Moons. Quite beautiful. The Stingray between the Wheel of Fortune and the Seven of Feathers. I do love how these decks work together visually in terms of both being kind of line work, heavy line work decks, and I think that they kind of have that inverse effect of each other. So whereas this is like the white line work on the black, here we have the black line work on the white, and I think that's really interesting how they kind of mirror each other in that aspect. I also really like how the in the wild unknown animal spirit, we get that pop of color that really draws our attention. Otherwise, it's a very heavy black and white illustrative style, and then you get those pops of color that really help to kind of hone into some element of the imagery and of the message. Quite beautiful. So quite a lovely deck. Again, it's one that I am fairly familiar with because I did work with quite a bit. I believe it was last year. Usually around the new year is when I tend to be drawn to my sort of black and white decks. But I love that this deck is very minimalistic, and it would, I think, pair nicely with a lot of different oracles if that's something that you are interested in doing, because we're not limited really by color palette. You can put a deck like this with a super busy oracle deck as we saw, or a very minimalistic oracle deck. You can pair it with another black and white deck, or a deck with a lot of color to it. And one of the things that I really like about that is that it allows you to kind of mix and match and play with what kind of energies you want to bring into your reading with these types of decks. I also personally enjoy pip style decks because, again, as I mentioned, it's really open to my own sort of interpretation or philosophy for when it comes to reading tarot. I'm not locked in to, say, Arthur Edward Waite's interpretation or Pamela Coleman Smith's artwork. It's much more open. Not that there's anything wrong with either one of those in styles. I do have quite a few RWS inspired decks as well as the RWS itself, and I do quite enjoy the system on the whole, but I really do like a pip style deck that allows me to tie in more of that numerological and elemental associations. That is really the foundation of how I read tarot and how I was taught to read tarot originally. So that really always appeals to me. And I love the versatility of a black and white deck. I love that it pairs with a lot of things because that is kind of the majority of the way that I do work with my tarot cards is with Oracle. So the Wanderer's Tarot was set to have released October 25th. I did look on Amazon and it does have an add to cart button, so I think it is available to order now, but the release date does now say November 8th. So I want to thank Wiser Books for sending me this deck to share with you today. I would love to know your thoughts on it, so please feel free to share with me in the comments below. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.